Welcome, everyone. I am so delighted to introduce our guest, Lindsay Stewart. As Stephanie said, is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Memphis. Her research focuses on developing Black feminist conceptions of political agency, with special attention to the intersection of sexuality, region, religion, and class. Much of her research has done this by philosophically developing the social and political insights that Zora Neale Hurston's nonfiction corpus presents. I had a chance to read her book, The Politics of Black Joy, Zora Neale Hurston and Neo-Abolitionism, when it first came out from Northwestern University Press. I was deeply moved by the power of the argument she advances, and in particular, the way Hurston refuses a form of abolitionist politics that links Blackness or the identities of Black people to tragedy. And as Stewart provocatively puts the question in the very opening of the book, here I quote, does not the very abjection that made us recognizable as humans, she's referring to Black people, as humans to white abolitionists, also endanger our access to the very categories of human subjectivity, end quote. The sense that we are agents and autonomous. In her reading of Hurston, Stewart invites us to imagine beyond the abolitionist model. She asks, what more might there be to Black life, especially Southern Black life? And in her analysis, we discover not a people whose identity is inescapably tied to struggle and resistance, but often a people whose politics of joy is defined both by refusal and indifference. This, now I should say, is not an abandonment of liberation, but an invitation to think about freedom and the foundations of it anew. It is my pleasure to welcome Lindsay Stewart as she discusses her book, The Politics of Black Joy, Zora Neale Hurston and Neo-Abolitionism. Thank you.
Can the Black poet sing a song to the morning? Up springs the song to his lips, but it is fought back. He says to himself, this is a beautiful song inside me. I feel the morning star in my throat. I will sing of the star and the morning. Then his background thrusts itself between his lips and the star, and he mutters, ought not I to be singing of our sorrows? That is what is expected of me, and I shall be considered forgetful of our past and present. If I do not, some will even call me a coward. The one subject for a Negro is the race and its sufferings, and so the song of the morning must be choked back. I will write of a lynching instead. So the same old theme, the same old phrases get done again to the detriment of art. To him, no Negro exists as an individual. He exists only as another tragic unit of the race. This in spite of the obvious fact that Negroes love and hate and fight and play and strive and travel and have 1,001 interests in life like other humans. When his baby cuts a new tooth, he brags shamelessly as anyone else without once weeping over the prospect of some Klansman knocking it out when and if the child ever gets grown. The Negro artist knows all this, but he conceives that a Negro can do nothing but weave something in a particular art form about the race problem. And that's from Hurston's essay, Art and Such. In this quote, Zora Neale Hurston points out a mismatch between the way Black folks, particularly in the South, live our lives and the way those lives get discussed in progressive circles. Well, our lives include love and fight and hate and play and 1,001 interests in life. Progressive representations of our lives often gets reduced to the racial oppression we face, as if all our lives were consumed with what white folks were doing to us, as if all our thoughts were preoccupied with the Klansmen at our door. Hurston was well aware that this tendency to center the racial oppression we face was part of a political strategy ultimately aimed at eradicating racism. We display our suffering to put public pressure on the nation to amend its racist ways. But Hurston is also well known for refusing to participate in this political strategy. Instead, she often criticized it, as she does here in this quote. And in her work, she pivoted to those aspects of our lives that have nothing to do with white folks. In her work, aspects that Toni Morrison defined as joy are the parts of our lives that were spent neither on our knees nor hanging from trees. Because of this pivot, Hurston was often at odds with many of her political contemporaries like Alain Locke, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Richard Wright. Indeed, her attempts to refuse this mismatch in the public sphere has earned her a peculiar reputation in scholarship, whereby she is rendered progressive in terms of her feminism and conservative in terms of her racial politics. In my work, I contest this reading of Hurston in scholarship, and I take Hurston's refusal of this mismatch as my theoretical starting point. Perhaps this because I too experienced this mismatch, though in other ways. As a Black Southerner who spent most of her college education up north, I was struck by how often there was a mismatch in the way Northerners perceived Black life in the South and what I had experienced growing up. It seemed as though they believed that racism in the South was the whole of Black life down here, so that no Black person would voluntarily choose to live here. And as a Black Southerner who decided to study topics of race and philosophy, I was even more struck by how hard it was to find material on Black American life that did not center our relationship to white folks, either how they're oppressing us or how we're resisting that oppression. This book comes out of these experiences of mismatch in my personal life, in my professional life as a philosopher, and in the broadest sense of my public life, that is, the public political culture of the United States in terms of media, news, national stories that we tell ourselves about Blackness and the South. In the book, I strove to work with Hurston to give an account of how and why this mismatch occurs, and why it is so hard for those of us who are progressive to tell stories that center Black joy in the South. To give this account of why Black joy is so often missing, I developed two concepts that guided my analyses. So what I'll do is lay out these two concepts for you, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the structure of the book in closing. So we're going to go on to Neo-Abolitionism. The two concepts are found in the title of my book, The Politics of Joy and Neo-Abolitionism. In the book, I wanted to offer a historical intellectual landscape that would help us to see how Black joy, especially in the South, garners political valences, and often the wrong political valences in progressive circles. Drawing this landscape required that I return to the antebellum period, which is where Hurston also turns. So for instance, Hurston writes in her essay, Negroes Without Self-Pity, look back over your shoulder for a minute, count the years. If you take in the 20-odd years of intense abolitionist speaking and writing that preceded the Civil War, the 4 war years, the Reconstruction period, and recent Negro rights agitations, you have at least 100 years of indoctrination of the Negro that he is an object of pity. What Hurston is laying out here in this quote is political norms of Black representation in the public sphere that has been shaped by the abolitionist struggle. These norms for Hurston do not disappear upon the abolition of slavery. Rather, they get re-entrenched during the Reconstruction period. So Hurston writes in an earlier essay, Art and Such, this post-Civil War generation time was a matrix from which certain ideas came that have seriously affected art creation, as well as every other form of Negro expression, including the economic. Out of this period of sound and emotion came the race man and race woman, that great horde of individuals known as race champions. The great Frederick Douglass was the original pattern, no doubt, for these people who went up and down the land, making speeches so fixed and tight as to become a folk pattern. We have in the passage I've given you, a model of political engagement developed by abolitionist Frederick Douglass being crystallized into a folk pattern in the Reconstruction period. I have called this re-entrenchment of abolitionist norms during the Reconstruction period Neo-Abolitionism. The prefix neo here registers that the originating context of these political strategies, that is slavery, has been significantly altered upon legal emancipation of the enslaved, while also marking the afterlife of these strategies in US public discourse. Hurston's critique of neo-abolitionism is that it sets the terms of our political recognition in the US public sphere to a demonstration of Black abjection, or that we render ourselves into objects of pity. Put another way, as we saw in the opening quote, in progressive circles, the representations of Black life get reduced to our oppression, such that the one subject for a Negro is the race and its sufferings. For Hurston, this tendency is due to the lingering norms of abolitionist discourse in the public sphere. One way to understand Hurston's critique is to consider the arguments abolitionists put forward against slavery during the antebellum period. Within the abolitionist campaign, Black suffering was used as evidence or proof of the moral reprehensibility of slavery. We see this, for example, in slave narratives, a main staple of abolitionist discourse. Hurston's claim that abolitionist discourse turns us into objects of pity concerns the political constraints that Black writers were under when composing slave narratives. Namely, what are the things that Black writers had to do to convince the right reader that slavery was evil? What are the rhetorical strategies and narrative tropes that Black writers had to employ to elicit recognition of their humanity in these white readers? And how do these strategies and tropes restrain the Black writer or overdetermine their stories? The issues Hurston was trying to raise is not whether slavery was wrong, clearly it was, or whether we suffered under it, clearly we did, but what happens when a show of suffering becomes a requirement for motivating white folks to recognize us as human and do the right thing by us politically? In the book, I developed my account of neo-abolitionism largely through the national debate over the nature of Negro spirituals during the antebellum period. I turned to the spirituals because this is one place where we can see how Black affect gets politically charged in our national public sphere. For many white folks, Black songmaking in the South was considered noise or unmeaning jargon. They did not know how to hear it, probably in part because of different music scales, rhythms, and languages in which the enslaved sang. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass introduced the most successful interpretation of Negro spirituals in his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. In this text, he argued that Negro spirituals were evidence of our suffering under enslavement and thus a testament to the abolitionist cause. So Douglass writes, this they would sing as a chorus to words which to many would seem unmeaning jargon, but which nevertheless were full of meaning to themselves. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than reading whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. I did not, when a slave, understand the deep meaning of those rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle, so that I neither saw nor heard as those without might see and hear. They told a tale of woe, which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. They were tones loud and long and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. Part of what made Douglass's interpretation of Negro spirituals so successful is that he tapped into the ways that Black affect was already being used in the national debate over whether slavery was moral. Instances of Black songmaking in the South were often used as evidence of Black joy by those in favor of slavery. They assumed our mere singing was evidence of contentment and happiness. This so-called evidence of Black joy under enslavement was used by pro-slavery advocates to ensure our oppression. If slaves were happy, so the pro-slavery argument goes, then slavery must not be some moral evil. In response to this argument, Douglass asserts that the pro-slavery advocates are grossly mistaken, that we sing most when we are unhappy, and that these songs, in fact, represent the sorrows of our heart. But Douglass writes, I have often been astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment and happiness. It is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. At least such is my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness. Crying for joy and singing for joy were alike uncommon to me while in the jaws of slavery. Through this interpretation, Douglass takes what was once ammunition for pro-slavery arguments and turns it into a weapon that abolitionists can wield. This is because his interpretation gave white readers a way of understanding Black songmaking that both debunked the pro-slavery argument and shored up the abolitionist cause. Our singing was evidence of our suffering under slavery. And central to this interpretation is that Black joy is banished from the spirituals and the experience of enslavement as a whole. Crying for joy and singing for joy, according to Douglass, were uncommon to him while in the jaws of slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois follows Douglass's suit in banishing Black joy from his account of Negro spirituals to the point of calling them sorrow songs. I argued in the book that Hurston's critique of the label sorrow songs stands in for a much larger critique of Du Bois's overall project, refashioning abolitionist tropes to meet the demands of the Reconstruction era. For instance, when compiling the souls of Black folk, Du Bois had an audience problem to solve. He was dealing with a largely Northern white audience whose sympathies to Black folks had been built through the abolitionist struggle. They were primed to identify with the suffering slave, such as hearing performances of spirituals. And that identification mobilized their efforts in the political struggle. How does Du Bois continue to garner their political sympathies when slavery has been abolished? I argue that Du Bois solves this problem by drawing upon staples of the abolitionist discourse, like the sorrow songs, to gain traction with his Northern white audience, while expanding the political meaning of the spirituals beyond the abolitionist target of emancipation. In other words, Du Bois finds a way to make the spirituals politically relevant beyond the problem of slavery. For example, Du Bois writes in The Souls of Black Folk, through all the sorrow of the sorrow songs, there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things. The minor cadences of despair change often to triumph and calm confidence. Sometimes it is faith in life, sometimes a faith in death, sometimes assurance of boundless justice and some fair world beyond. But whichever it is, the meaning is always clear, that sometime, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not by their skins. In this passage, Du Bois tells us that through all the sorrow of the sorrow songs, there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things. The political meaning of that faith is that somewhere, sometime, men will judge men by their souls and not by their skins. This reframing of the spirituals represents a subtle shift from Douglass's interpretation of the spirituals as a testament against slavery. For Du Bois, the spirituals are now a testament against racial injustice more broadly. In this way, Douglass expands the political message of the sorrow songs beyond the mere abolition of slavery. Now, the sorrow songs stand as a model of racial justice to meet the demands of the Reconstruction era, where Blacks are still not judged by their souls, but by their skins. By refashioning a staple of abolitionist discourse, the spirituals, as relevant to the current problems of his day, Du Bois found a way to make his political message land with his Northern white abolitionist audience. And he was largely successful with this refashioning, given how politically charged the term abolitionism still is in our contemporary progressive landscape. Now, you might be thinking, why does this matter? Even if abolitionists did reduce Black life to the oppression we faced, it was an effective strategy. Slavery does get abolished after all, at least legally. I think Hurston is motivated to consistently reject the abolitionist norm to represent Black life in terms of sorrow for two reasons. She's not only motivated by a deep sense of self-respect, but also by an awareness of the perverse pleasure that even our liberal allies may obtain in witnessing our abjection. Put in a slightly different and more contemporary way, Hurston wondered, like Saidiya Hartman, for whom does one expose the pained Black body? Abolitionists used this exposure of our suffering to motivate white folks to join the anti-slavery cause. But the same white pity solicited by abolitionists to further their cause could also reinforce racism. Toni Morrison put it this way in her novel, Jazz. There are two kinds of white people, the ones that feel sorry for you and the ones that don't. And both amount to the same thing. Nowhere in between is respect. That is, white pity could undermine the very possibility of political recognition by casting Black folks in a position of inferiority. In this way, neo-abolitionism can work to further entrench racism in progressive circles instead of abolishing it. Hurston's sensitivity to this racist dynamic, even in those we consider allies, fed her deep pessimism in the ability of whites to truly offer us political recognition. This is important to stress, for without such racial pessimism, the Southern Black joy for which Hurston advocates whittles down to the minstrel's nostalgia or Black romanticism. Right, moving on to the politics of joy. So far, I've discussed how neo-abolitionism mandates that Black life, especially Southern Black life, be represented in terms of sorrow and suffering. For Hurston, these were the terms of political recognition to be gained by her progressive allies. She felt their allyship was based upon a sentiment of racial pity, once orchestrated through the abolitionist struggle. Her response to this mandate was one of refusal. She out and out refused to render herself into an object of pity. Rather than perform a show of suffering in the public sphere, Hurston often insisted on displaying Black Southern joy in the public sphere. I have called her refusal of Northern neo-abolitionist pity and her efforts to decenter our relationship to oppression, especially racism, in the public sphere, the politics of joy. This is not to say that joy is political in itself. Instead, politics here refers to the intellectual historical landscape of the antebellum period, through which representations of Black joy, especially Southern Black joy, accrues political charges. I want to emphasize that this turn to joy is not as naive as some might think. On the contrary, The politics of joy is undergirded by an intimate knowledge of the limitations of racist white folks. What are you to do when you're forced to be in a conversation with people who are unable to hear you? How are you to proceed when you know you have no hope of being recognized by them as human, as equal? One route may be to say nothing, to refuse to continue the conversation. I don't think that option was available by and large for Black folks who were often in close quarters with white folks in the South during Hurston's time. But there was another option that Hurston saw modeled in her work as an anthropologist. Hurston writes in Mules and Men, respondents are most reluctant to reveal that which the soul lives by. And the Negro, in spite of his open-faced laughter, his seeming acquiescence, is particularly evasive. You see, we are a polite people, and we do not say to our questioner, get out of here. We smile and tell him or her something that satisfies the white person because knowing so little about us, he doesn't know what he's missing. The theory behind our tactics, the white man is always trying to know into somebody else's business. All right, I'll set something outside the door of my mind for him to play with and handle. He can read my writing, but he sure can't read my mind. I'll put this play toy in his hand and he'll seize it and go away. Then I'll say my say and sing my song. There are quite a few things to note from this passage. First, Hurston is aware of an epistemic gap between her and white folks. She knows that due to racism, white folks may not be equipped to truly see us for who we are. They simply aren't in a position to offer us true recognition. This epistemic gap changes the stakes and the social engagement before us. What are your goals in this interaction, given these limitations? What do you do if true recognition is off the table in a social engagement you're forced to have? Hurston was quite happy to exploit the misrecognition of white folks if it meant her inner life was left in peace, where she could say her say and sing her song. Her willingness to exploit rather than correct the misrecognition of white folks earned the criticism of her progressive contemporaries. And this is partly why she's often considered conservative in terms of her racial politics. I argue that another way of interpreting Hurston is to see that she's not interested in playing a game she can't win. And so the goals of her interaction with white folks in these scenarios change from a true revelation of the self to protection of the self by any means necessary. Or at the risk of being even more anachronistic, as the great Billie Holiday once said, if you can't be free, be a mystery. Perhaps this is but one reason why Hurston embraced the mysteries of conjure or root work in so much of her writing. Indeed, in Hurston's writing on conjure, we often find a refusal of the neo-abolitionist mandate that we reduce the story of Southern Black life, especially enslaved life, to a tale of misery and woe. For instance, in one of Hurston's most famous essays on conjure, High John the Conqueror, we find another example of the politics of joy at play. Old Massa couldn't know, of course, but High John the Conqueror was there walking his plantation like a natural man. He was treading the sweat-flavored clods of the plantation, crushing out his drum tunes and giving out secret laughter. He walked on the winds and moved fast. Maybe he was in Texas when the lash fell on a slave in Alabama. But before the blood was dry on the back, he was there. A faint pulsing of a drum like a goat skin stretched over a heart that came nearer and closer. Then somebody in the saddened quarters would feel like laughing and say, now High John the Conqueror, old Massa couldn't get the best of him. That old John was a case. Then everybody sat up and began to smile. Yes, yes, that's right. Old John, High John could beat the unbeatable. He was top superior to the whole mess of sorrow. He could beat it all. And what made it so cool, finish it off with a laugh. At the sites where abolitionists sought to emphasize our sorrow the most, such as the whipping post, Hurston inserts secret laughter through the folk figure and herbal root, High John the Conqueror. Moreover, Hurston is aware that this secret laughter violates the readerly expectations of her white progressive audience. For instance, Hurston further writes in the essay, "It is no accident that High John the Conqueror has evaded the ears of white people. They were not supposed to know. You can't know what folks won't tell you. If they, the white people, heard some scraps, they could not understand because they had nothing to hear things like that with. They were not looking for any hope in those days, and it was not much of a strain for them to find something to laugh over. Old John would have been out of place for them." Hurston knows this secret laughter won't land or get the right kind of uptake in our white audience because they had nothing to hear things like that with. And we find again a deep pessimism in white folks' ability to recognize us undergirding this turn to joy or secret laughter. Rather than seek the recognition of her white audience that's not even in a position to give it, Hurston refuses to pay them attention and absconds into her own secret laughter or joy. In this essay, Hurston ties this secret laughter found in conjure to many things: hope, a type of courage that endures, and self-determination or winning within, and perhaps most important, knowledge that white folks are not the whole world. For instance, Hurston incorporates interviews with women like Aunt Saidiya Sutton and Aunt Diskey, who are known to be conjurers by their use of High John the Conqueror. In her interview with Aunt Saidiya Sutton, Hurston asks about High John the Conqueror, and this is Aunt Saidiya Sutton's response. "Sure, John the Conqueror means power. That's bound to be so. He came to teach us and tell us, God don't leave nobody ignorant, you child. Don't care where he drop you down, he puts you on notice. He don't want folks taken advantage of because they don't know. Now, back in slavery time, us didn't have no power of protection, and God knowed it and put us under watch and care. Rattlesnakes never bit no colored folks until 4 years after freedom was declared. That was to give us time to learn and to know. Of course, I don't know nothing about slavery personal life. I wasn't born till 2 years after the big surrender. Then I couldn't know nothing but what they told me. My mama told me, and I know she wouldn't mislead me, how High John the Conqueror helped us out. He had done teached the Black folks, so they know it 100 years ahead of time that freedom was coming, long before the white folks knowed anything about it at all. For Aunt Saidiya Sutton, High John the Conqueror is a source of knowledge that helped the enslaved in situations where they lacked certain kinds of power. This is because the conjure practices that enlist High John the Conqueror are a site of intellectual production. For example, certain types of knowledge about the world was passed down through generations of conjure women, from how to prevent snake bites, perhaps in the swamps to which many of the enslaved escaped, to the fact that slavery was an untenable system, and as Aunt Sutton proclaims, freedom just had to come. Most important, High John the Conqueror provided a means of interpreting and judging the world that differed from their slave masters. Consider the following passage involving conjure, from conjure woman Aunt Diskey. "They heard what Massa said, and they felt bad right off. But John the Conqueror took them and told them, saying, 'Don't pay what he say, no mind. You know where you got something finer than this plantation, and anything it's got on it, put away. Ain't that funny? Us got all that, and he don't know nothing at all about it. Don't tell him nothing. Nobody don't have to know where our pleasure from. Come on, pick up your hoes and let's go.' They all began to laugh and grabbed up their hoes and started out. Ain't that funny?" Aunt Diskey laughed and hugged herself with secret laughter. "Us got all the advantage, and old Massa think he got us tied." In this passage, High John the Conqueror provides the grounds for the enslaved to refuse the terms of reality the master supplied, and to furnish their own. Hurston thought that these aspects of Black life displayed by the conjure women here were missing from progressive racial politics during her time. In contrast to the secret laughter or pleasure that informed the politics of conjure women, Hurston noticed that the progressive race campaigns that got uptake nationally were informed by neo-abolitionism, where we are rendered objects of pity. And I should add that this turn to secret laughter or joy and conjure has been incredibly fruitful in producing a viable Black feminist intellectual tradition within African-American thought. In fact, there is a bevy of Black feminists who see conjure as a site of Black feminist intellectual development. For example, in 1976, Alice Walker tells us it was Hurston's work on conjure that provided a model for her own intellectual development as a writer. In 1978, Barbara Smith also turns to conjure in developing a model of Black feminist literary criticism. To Smith, Black female activities of root working, herbal medicine, conjure, midwifery are part of an identifiable literary tradition in Black women's writing. And in 1998, Angela Davis turns to the conjure women in Bessie Smith's songs to retrieve a legacy of Black feminist empowerment, where women were presented as spiritual leaders in the community. For all of these Black feminist thinkers, Hurston is a central figure in the development of conjure as a Black feminist intellectual tradition that decenters the white gaze. All right, so I want to shift gears now and tell you a little bit about the structure of the book in closing. I chose to focus the book on Hurston's essays because it's in her essays that I often found the play between pessimism and the politics of recognition and joyful performances of refusal most striking. Each chapter focuses on one of her more famous essays, Art and Such, Spirituals and Neo-Spirituals, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, and High John the Conqueror. In each chapter, I aim to show how Hurston performs a refusal of neo-abolitionist mandates and embraces a politics of joy. Each chapter is also preceded by an interlude on scenes from Beyoncé Knowles' visual album Lemonade. These interludes are designed to give readers a contemporary example of what the politics of joy might look like, as I found deep parallels between Hurston and Beyoncé in terms of their aesthetic sensibilities and their political proclivities. They both seem to want to embrace Black Southern joy in the public sphere, and they both seem to understand that you have to return to the antebellum period to get why Black Southern joy causes such a problem in progressive circles. The interludes are also provided to prepare the reader for the types of moves or ways that I will interpret Hurston in the following chapters. I structured the book in this way because I want the book to be taught. I want to see Hurston's work taught alongside some of our major figures in the African-American intellectual tradition, not just her fiction. I want to see her essays engaged at the level of a political theorist. Indeed, part of my argument is that Hurston launches a serious critique of a very long tradition of Black writing, abolitionism, and offers us an alternative tradition, the politics of joy. These two concepts that I develop in concept with Hurston are contributions to Black political theory that can yield invigorating and fruitful discussions about where we are today and how perhaps we should recalibrate our goals. To facilitate teaching Hurston's essays in this way, each chapter can stand alone and be assigned with a particular essay, such as the chapter titled Sing a Song to the Morning and Hurston's essay, Art and Such. And I provided concrete examples through the interludes that would hopefully ease students into the material and help them get more of a sense of what I'm up to and what the stakes are in my arguments. It's quite likely that we wouldn't have any of Hurston's writings without Black feminist teachers in the late 60s and early 70s who literally made copies of her out-of-print works to press into their students' hands. I see this book as continuing in that tradition by philosophically pressing Hurston's essays into yours. Thank you.
I think we can move to the question and answer session. You all should feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom. And I suppose while we wait for some questions to come in, because I really want you to have an opportunity to engage Lindsay, Professor Stewart, in this extraordinary book. But while we wait for those questions to come in, maybe I'll put a question to you. So I really enjoyed this book. I will be teaching this book for sure. So imagine a person says, yes, I see the worry. I see the worry, the ways in which Black folks are reduced to their abjection. I see the worry of the ways in which they're reduced to their tragedy. But that part of the hallmark of politics is about attending to each other. And when we fall short of that, we call each other out on that. And one way we do it is to stage the grievance. Mm-hmm. And that staging is part of moving people from one side to the other. That's the hallmark of politics. And so you're right, that Hurston's right that Du Bois seems to focus on the sorrow songs in its darker tone. You're right, Douglass seems before him to do the same, and a whole generation of Black thinkers seem to do the same. But that's part of moving the audience from one side to another, and it need not be in tension, or it need not preclude, although that's not what one is focusing on, the possibility of joy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, so I think that Hurston would say a couple of things to that. I think the first thing that she would say is, how is that working for you? Or how is that working for the nation? Right? So how many videos of Black people killed by the police do you need to see to be moved to support cases against police brutality? And she might even go further and say, in some ways, consumption of violence against Black people is something that the nation has an appetite for, such that it doesn't move us politically to fight racism. In fact, it feeds a kind of perverse desire to see more Black suffering. And so she would say, I guess in the first kind of sense, does that really work? I think in her own day, she wrote a letter, I think it was to Elaine Locke, where she was saying, people are asking me, why don't I put more lynching in my books? And she says, as if white people don't know that we're being lynched. What is a lynching in my novel gonna do to move the white people who already know about lynching? And so I think for her, it isn't so much a question of they don't know, or maybe if we just kind of stage our grievances that they'll see that they're wrong and change. She thinks that the situation in some ways is much more dire with the people that we're dealing with. And I think kind of moving past Hurston, I would also say in our own time, is it the case that showing people how much we're suffering is actually enlisting white folks on our side? Or is it something that they've kind of already heard and know how to rehearse and don't even feel anymore?
It's heavy. So we have a question here, Dana Gooley. Thank you for this illuminating talk. In his 2 books on the blues, Albert Murray was set on reversing the then common interpretation of the blues as a straight expression of sorrow. He countered this by stressing the counteracting affirmative aspects of the blues. Do you think Murray, himself a Southerner, might have been working in Hurston's line of thought. I ask in part because you trace the influence of Hurston forward through Black feminist lines.
Mm-hmm. So I have to say, I don't know. I don't know Murray's work. From what you've told me, that seems right, that there is this affirmative register in the blues, and that he's probably sensitive to that, having been raised in the South or being a Southerner.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So as we wait for more questions, the last really sort of the sort of substantive response to my reflection, you know, how's that working for you? I think is apt. And Hurston, of course, stands in a long line, you know, with Martin Delany, with Stokely Carmichael, with Marcus Garvey. I mean, she's part of this group to the extent that there's a certain understanding of a certain account of white people that one is working with. And so I'm struck by this line because I think that there's a question that still lingers, which is what is to be done? And this is connected to the politics of joy that you offer up. So the line comes from page 41. And this is out of Hurston's My Most Humiliating Jim Crow Experience. And we get, I still mean pathos, she writes, for I know that anything with such a false foundation cannot last. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. And then so you sort of go on and you say some things about that. But the upshot is that one's white counterparts are in fact mad. Mm-hmm. So if we take that as settled, but we still find ourselves in relationships of dependency, that in fact we're not in a relationship in which we exercise sovereign authority over ourselves. We find ourselves in relationships of dependencies in which it matters for us realizing the goods of life. I mean, is it enough simply to sort of take comfort in a kind of inner peace, or can one take comfort in a kind of inner peace or a kind of inner quiet when that is often tied to sort of structural economics and political conditions?
Yeah, and I think it matters too, kind of where Hurston was situated, where she was living, and the sort of interactions that she saw. Because I think in those sort of situations where, especially for Hurston, you kind of have to remember that she wasn't always in a position to say exactly what she thought about things, right? And what you see kind of modeled in like Mules and Men is this sort of, so the person that I'm dealing with can't really hear me. I'm not in a position to just walk away from them because there are all these sorts of relationships kind of built in the South that I cannot just avoid this person. And when you're in that situation for Hurston, one thing that she found a lot of Southerners were doing is just kind of going along with the deceit that white folks already have about them. The sense of why bother correcting them when they've already made up their minds about me? Now, I think in terms of inner peace, I think I maybe put it, I put it that way, but one way to think about it too is it's kind of developing a sense of emotional sovereignty when you don't have that kind of political sovereignty. It's, I'm going to create a space where I know that white folks are kind of doing all this stuff that's bothering me in all these other ways. I'm going to create a space that's just for me, where white folks can't go. And I would say that developing that kind of space is important if you're ever going to politically organize. So it's kind of something that precedes the sort of reaction to structural injustices that may be needed, right? So I would definitely say that this emotional sovereignty is not kind of the end all be all tool that's going to fix everything, but it might be something that's needed before you like kind of getting your mind right, before you can even begin to collectively join and fight against the structural injustices.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. No, I think that's powerful. I think there's something right to it, and of course, it does point to a kind of partitioning of the political that the book seems to again and again point to. So we have another question here from Donnell Williamson, and he asks, Dr. Stewart, thank you so much for sharing this thoughtful and brilliant presentation on your text and its evaluation of Hurston's nonfiction. I'm interested in Hurston's essay, How It Feels to Be a Colored Me. In the essay, Hurston calls herself a cosmic Zora and places herself outside of race and time. Would rendering Hurston's position as disengaging or withdrawing from racial concerns be unjust? I understand that she would not want to be considered a race woman. Your book makes mention of the intra and interracial politics. Could you say more about your thoughts on these things? I'd be happy to expound if necessary.
Yeah, so that little, I mean, How It Feels to Be Colored Me is such a challenging read. It's a deceptively simple essay. And part of what I tried to do with the book is just kind of bring out some of the other dimensions going on with the essay. So I think that the essay reads in a certain way. If you take that, Hurston is trying to do everything that she can to not confirm this sense that people already have of her, which is that being a Black woman is a profoundly sorrowful existence. So one of the things that I try to do with that essay is say, you cannot take anything at face value, and that you kind of want to see everything that she's doing in that essay as throwing kind of a different wrench into the narrative that I am Black, therefore I am sorrowful and tragic. And one of the ways that she does try to do that is move herself beyond even identity categories, which honestly, I don't think it really works, but it's one of the things that she does try in that essay. And some of this language of cosmic Zora is definitely tied to her interest in philosophy, in particular her interest in Spinoza. So some of the Spinoza language also comes up in that essay. Yeah.
All right, so we got a good number. Thank you for that. We got a good number of questions in here now. So Maggie Murphy, she asked, do you think that the media should be more restrained in what they choose to show? For example, vivid and disturbing pictures and videos of killings of Black people, because some may argue that these images have prompted this mass mobilization we are seeing currently, but at the same time, it is brutal and dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think for me, I wouldn't want my last minutes where I'm violently killed to be used as a pedagogical tool. I know that there's something to be said for when families agree to release those images. But my main worry would be that people are desensitized to it now, right? And it's like, yeah, we did get mass mobilization, but if you kind of look at where, just looking at white people in the nation, kind of where they were in support of Black Lives Matter in 2020, it dipped really quickly. Like they were with us for a minute and then dropped very quickly. So I don't even know how much we can say that the gains are due to necessarily the videos or images being seen, as opposed to the amount of on the ground organizing that people have been doing around these issues. We can't reduce this, I don't think we should reduce this political moment to the videos we've been seeing and how much the videos are making people cry about the suffering that we're enduring. I'd much rather focus on what are the things that we're doing differently now to across the board, not just with police brutality, but also with voting registration and all those sorts of things. We're seeing a lot of organizing around these issues, and that has to be part of the story.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. We have another one here, but a very quick one. How much of this book is really about your concern, Hurston's concern, with the psychological health of Black people, and that the attempt to focus on this, even though you sort of press this quite intensely, but that the intent to focus on this is really not to the exclusion of other political approaches as much as it is to those political approaches excluding a preoccupation or concern with the health of Black folks, the psychological health of Black people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I think Hurston was very much so interested in and she puts it one way, you know, she's trying to win the souls of Black folk so that they're whole and free, right? It's not even, you know, it's not even for her so much about the institutional problems. She knows that they're there. Mm-hmm. I think that this is the thing that always got her into trouble, is that she wasn't so much focused on that, but mostly focused on who are we and what can we do when we're in a good place, a healthy place. She felt like she saw that in the town that she grew up, Eatonville. She's very interested in self-determination. I also think it's important that we just don't end up believing that white people are the whole world and everything that we do is revolving around white people, because I know that's not how we live. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think appropriately, Ethnicity Toussaint, I hope I got that right, brother. But he has a question I think sort of is quite appropriate for this, because it brings or attempts to bring Hurston in conversation with another figure. And so he asks, this might be an unfair question because it is beyond the scope of the project, but I'm wondering how you see Hurston's political theory in conversation with James Baldwin and his conception of the project of Black liberation. Are Zora Neale Hurston urging us to go somewhere different than Baldwin?
Right. So, okay, that's a big question. Mm-hmm. There's so much Baldwin. Yeah, I do think that there are places where they resonate. So one place where they both, where they resonate with each other is this fierce love of Black people in all of their messy forms, and this refusal to reduce the messiness to something that is neat and repeatable. And so I think Baldwin also criticizes Richard Wright along similar lines that Hurston does, because there is this sense that there is this script that Wright is following that Baldwin also has issues with. I think another place where they resonate is a criticism of sentimentality, right? I think Hurston, she wouldn't put it this way, but I think a lot of what she was complaining about with abolitionism would fit Baldwin's critique of sentimentality in American discourse. Right? So that's just two places where I think they resonate very strongly.
All right, so Jay Delacav Dr. Stewart, thank you so much for your work and this excellent presentation. I'm wondering if your book addresses or if you have any thoughts on Hurston's work with ethnography and dance, and specifically how Hurston might read Black joy through dancing bodies. Thank you.
That's a great question. I do not have the answer to that because I did not focus on dance. The primary thing I was focused on with Hurston is, in terms of her work as an ethnographer, is conjure. But I could totally see how that could work. So hopefully somebody listening will take that up. Hurston and dance and joy.
All right, so we have a question from Will Johnson. Thank you so much for this work. I'm curious to know more about the term joy. How do we locate, trace, map that term? It seems like joy, when related to Blackness, exceeds the axis of normative, i.e. white understanding of sorrow, joy. I'm wondering if joy might also come to mean something more like the ineffable or sublime, or just an altogether different space that cannot be fully enclosed in knowledge, especially as it pertains to Blackness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, there's so many different ways that a lot of Black thinkers have thought about joy. One of the ways that I've tried to kind of help people see what I mean by it is actually to link it to Audre Lorde's discussion of the erotic. The way that Audre Lorde talks about the erotic is that it's this deep affirmation that also is self-determining. And that's how I'm seeing joy. So that's one connection with a thinker that gives you kind of a tradition in which I'm looking at joy. But it's very hard to define. I also like Toni Morrison's definition, but it's a little bit too broad. But yeah, I also kind of like this sense of the sublime. I'm going to think more about that.
So I wonder if that response is connected to this next question. I'll read it, and maybe it is, or maybe you want to say a little bit more here, but it's again about joy. Can you talk about your selection of the term joy? I'm thinking about discourses that point to non-traumatic sentiments and feelings of marginalized people, feminist politics of pleasure. Mm-hmm. And then there's Black boy joy, Black future. Is joy sentimental, sexual, relational, or how do you see your work engaging similar discourses?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in some ways I pick joy because it's in one way it's easily identifiable as the opposite of sorrow. Right, so it's a good way of framing mechanism. It's also the word that Toni Morrison uses in an essay that's been profoundly influential on me. It's the essay is Rediscovering Black History. So I was also kind of moved towards the sense of the term joy. It's not really a term that Hurston uses very often. So it's my kind of imposing, this term on her. But the way that Hurston is kind of thinking about affirming states of Blackness is very reminiscent of the way that philosopher Spinoza talks about joy. And Hurston really loved Spinoza. So there's kind of a connection there with joy. The other thing that I really liked about joy is that I think it can be distinguished from states like pleasure and happiness, although there's definitely overlap with these states as well. I kind of think of joy as more of sorry, it's another philosopher, but William James, the sense of attitudes and kind of habitual. So it kind of is more of a state that you're not easily moved from once you cultivate it.
All right. So, I mean, one of the things that I found interesting about the book was a kind of a thread that runs through the book. It is not the explicit thread because of the things that you're concerned with, but it is there, which is about how do we stand to or read the tradition of African-American political theory. Mm-hmm. And so there's often a sort of critique about this from the right. And so, you know, someone like a Booker T. Washington is pulled out. But interestingly, this is a critique from the left. Yeah. Right. So we might say it's a critique from the left. So what is, let me ask it this way, what is at stake both in our sort of history of the philosophy of this tradition and at stake pedagogically in taking up Hurston and taking up this text of yours?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that's at stake, and one of the reasons why, in some ways, I'm trying to make it even more pronounced that Hurston is coming from the left in a way and making this critique, is because there is already a narrative of Hurston as a conservative in terms of racial politics. Mm-hmm. And that means that when we're teaching her, the racial politics is left out if we're trying to teach a course about, I don't know, Black liberation. So I think that's partly what's at stake for me, is making sure that she's included in discussions of Black liberation, but where she's placed in that discussion is not kind of on the right and dismissible in a sense, but actually no, she's talking to everybody who you think is radical. She's talking to y'all. Mm-hmm. I think that makes her argument a little bit more serious and something that needs to be contended with.
And so in thinking about her coming from the left in this way, and here we move into her politics, you have a discussion of this. One is immediately reminded, because it's quite dramatic, of the 1955 piece that she writes to the Sentinel. I think she's in Florida, Orlando. And basically, she goes after Brown v. Board, and somewhat viciously.
Yes.
Share with us, talk about philosophically, politically, what is at stake in her going after a Brown, because it's easily read as a conservative move, but but you want to say there's something else going on, and this too is a window onto the politics of joy that she's offering us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, I think there are several things at stake for her with Brown v. Board. And so I think one, she's very concerned about what sorts of legal arguments fly, and what kind of assumptions about Black people are behind those legal arguments, right? So she's very concerned about this narrative that Black people are suffering. That's why we need to be integrated into these schools. And she says kind of very clearly in that essay, if this is just about, resources, right? If this is just about there simply aren't good Black schools, by all means, let us integrate, right? But she's like, but I know that there are good Black schools in the South, right? So for her, she thought that what's kind of behind all of this is that decision is this sense that if you move us closer to white people, that is what's going to set us on track in the nation. And she is absolutely opposed to that sort of thinking. So it's one of those, when I read that essay, it's one that I am very sympathetic to the logic. I'm very sympathetic to this thought that basically when you don't deal with all of the different ways that anti-Blackness occurs in a society, forced integration can lead to even more racism. And I think at the end of the day, she was trying to kind of warn us of if we're not on equal footing in this society, and they try to force us to integrate, that means that we're gonna be devalued in the very institutions that we've been integrated into. So I'm very sympathetic to the logic. At the same time, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for these integrated institutions, right? So it's one of those spaces of tension that even I have with Hurston of, I get it. I really, really get it. I'm not sure what to do with it because I wouldn't have the degree I have without, Penn State. So that's kind of where I am.
Right. I mean, when I read that portion of the book, it put me in the mind of Liz Anderson's 2010 book, The Imperative of Integration, which, as the title suggests, really sort of tells it all. And one thread of that argument is about the proximity of Black people to their white counterparts on the social capital and the life that they have. And I thought to myself, reading your book, that this is precisely the kind of thing that Hurston would recoil from, because in the very imperative of integration is a way of affirming precisely the thing that you're trying to address, which is a fundamental disregard for the standing of Black folks, and therefore a kind of inequality between them and white folks. So the thought is that, in fact, you got to be next to white folks in order to move up, but there's a way in which that sort of reinscribes. And of course, someone like Tommy Shelby, in his book, I thought, Dark Ghettos, I thought about your book in this regard, that you two, Hurston and Shelby, seem to be very, very concerned about the potential damage that comes from insisting on a form of integration in a context of intense disregard. And that there's good reason then to there's good reason not to insist on that. And of course, we're not immune to insisting on that even today, right? So we have a sort of return questioner to Santi. He asked in a 2020 article in The Atlantic, "Racism is Terrible, Blackness is Not." Professor Imani Perry wrote, "And so I must turn the pitying gaze back upon any who offer it to me because they cannot understand the spiritual majesty of joy and suffering. What do you think Hurston would have to say about the idea of joy and suffering?" Now, you, Perry, and Hurston, you all are the same crew and something. So what would she say here?
Yeah, I mean, so in some ways you might say that Hurston isn't trying to say that we don't suffer. And if anything, she's trying to say that it's more than suffering. And that even, to some degree, I'm going to turn to Morrison here for this. There's even this sort of grace and way that we bear the suffering that's you would say is deeply moving and is beyond the suffering itself. So I think that Hurston would be okay. I think Hurston would. I mean, I feel like Hurston and Imani Perry are pretty much on the same team.
I think that's right. That's why I said the three of you are, because I think you three, particularly Imani Perry in the most recent book, I think that there's a shared orientation, there's a shared ethos to how the South is viewed, and to how Black suffering is mobilized, weaponized, and handled, and not always in the service of those whose suffering it is. So let's if some more questions come in, we'll take those. But let's shift to the pedagogical side of this book, because you ended your conclusion with saying, when you wrote this book, you were thinking about the classroom. And you were thinking about students, how they might be able to receive it, how to frame it such that they could take it up, how to structure it in such a way that it sort of marks off or it's sort of indexed to specific essays and the like. So how much of this is about instructions for students as such, whether we're talking about Africana, whether we're talking about political science, political theory, whether we're talking about philosophy, history, American studies, how much is it about that? How much of it is about the philosophy classroom?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And philosophy's relationship, historic
Yeah.
relationship to this tradition.
Yeah. Right. So I'm not expecting it to be taught that much in philosophy classrooms, to just tell you the truth. I like it. I'd like it. And perhaps it might show up in African American philosophy or courses like that. But I foresaw it as mostly an interdisciplinary effort.
Mm-hmm.
Because Hurston sits in so many disciplines that I hope that there's a little bit of something in there for anthropology, for history, for literature, but also political science. And one of the ways that I wanted to kind of make it more broad and accessible is to kind of anchor it with something that hopefully students are familiar with already, which is lemonade. Hopefully they've seen it. So there's already something that they can kind of look at, identify, kind of in a visual and auditory sense, kind of connect with, that'll help them through some arguments that they may not be familiar with, even some figures that they may not be familiar with. I'm also thinking about courses that I took as an undergrad in Africana studies or African American studies, where Hurston was not there. Or if she was there, it was How It Feels to Be Colored Me, without a rich context to understand. The first time I read How It Feels to Be Colored Me, it was taught alongside Richard Wright's Blueprint for Negro Writing. And without context of Hurston's essay, I didn't like it. I was like, what is this? This is somebody who's like not race conscious. Like I needed so much more to get where Hurston was coming from. And this book is hopefully that so much more that a student might get in, introduction to African American thought or something.
Mm-hmm. No, that's wonderful. So we have a few minutes left. Ask the audience if there are any final questions before I ask Lindsay to say a few final words of what she hopes we'll get out of this. We just heard the pedagogical move, but finally what she hopes we'll get out of this. Politically, we've had some of that already, but I want to give an opportunity to sort of reiterate, as it were, the significance of this for our politics, in particular our politics for today. All right, so Lindsay, I mean, we find ourselves at a really sort of difficult and trying time where white supremacy is on the rise, where it's out of the shadows and back into the light, where Black people seem to be enduring a renewed form of public assault. So I say renewed form of public assault because we don't want to suggest that somehow they weren't, because you can see it, but a renewed form of public assault. And at a time where the kinds of sort of philosophical resources that seem to be coming out of some kinds of Black studies, Africana studies programs seem to suggest, I would think of Afro-pessimism, seems to suggest that we ought to sort of evacuate the space of politics. So at this critical juncture, I mean, what finally should we take from the book by way of its guidance for our politics today, this moment.
Mm-hmm. So, I had this exchange with a friend recently, where we were talking about the book, and she was saying, yeah, the Joy stuff is great, but I'm still scared to leave my house because of the police. Like, I'm still scared I'll get shot down. Right. I didn't quite know what to say to her in that moment. But like reflecting on it more, I thought, but you left your house anyway, right? And I think that this book is kind of helping us to think about what are the things that still get us out of the house. Yes, we're in a very dangerous place right now. Yes, there is so much just kind of wrong with this nation right now. Are you still getting out of bed? What's getting you out of bed? Right? What are those resources that our ancestors had that got them up, that got them out? People like Harriet Tubman certainly knew it was awful, was still able to do stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was for her, it was these religious traditions, these visions that she was having, right? That this sense of vocation and calling. It wasn't sitting around stewing, worrying about white people. It was the sense that I've been called to do something that motivated her. And that's kind of the aspects of Black life that I'm trying to capture in the book.
Thank you very much. So, Professor Lindsay Stewart, thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful text.
Yeah.
And I want to thank all of the participants for joining us, and for those wonderful, wonderful questions. Once again, thank you.
Thank you.